Hi, good evening. I hope you've had a good beginning to the week. I'm in Raipur, and in Raipur, we are under lockdown for another 7 8 days till the 19th of April. So let's see what lies ahead. In Chhattisgarh, more than 18 or 19 districts are under various stages of lockdown. So more than two-thirds of the state is under lockdown. And one of the best things that you can do if you really do not want to reflect on what's happening outside and be consumed by it is to get into another world altogether. And there's no better way to do that than to dive into the pages of a book. And so today evening, I'll be bringing to you a wonderful book. It's a very, very delightful book about which I'm going to talk in just a minute. Before that, a few words of experience. So, in high school, when I was in Bangalore, we had a really lousy history teacher. I'm not going to mention his name, but then the gentleman would come into class. As it is, he looked a little timid and unsure about what he wanted to do. But then, once he settled in, he would pick up the history textbook and keep it close to his face like this and start reading. I suspected he had eyesight problems because he used to wear thick glasses. And as he read from the book line by line in a monotonous manner, the class would go berserk. We would start throwing chalk pieces at each other, you know, paper pellets, and so on. He was totally oblivious to what was happening. He didn't care. And as the bell rang, he would quietly close the book, walk out of the class. That's how we learned history for most part of my high school. And so you can imagine by the time I came out of school, I had developed a great distaste for history. And even before that, I think, history is a subject which unfortunately is taught in the most ridiculous and the driest and the most unimaginative manner possible. So much so that many of us actually experimented with writing all kinds of things in the history paper and still ending up getting decent marks. So there was this joke that used to go around that in the history paper you had to write the first few sentences and the last few sentences right, because that's what the teachers anyway read, and in the middle you could fill it up with trash. I've even done that because I just couldn't bring myself to memorize dates and events and stuff and so on. That's sad. I mean, we often talk of how language is taught, we often talk of how mathematics and science are taught, and we lament the fact that these are not taught in an interesting manner. But how often do we ask how history is taught and how much more exciting it can be? At the heart of learning history is this matter of human nature. What kind of people were there? Why did they behave in a particular manner? And you can ask a lot of what if questions in history. What if this had happened? What if this had not happened? And what if this person had done this or not done this, and so on. So there is so much of the collective human condition that can be understood, and it can be brought to the child in such interesting and exciting ways through the story. So with this history teacher, we wanted him to tell us stories. We wanted him to tell us stories of India's partition, because that was a huge chapter, huge area that we were studying in school. We wanted him to tell us about stories of intrigue, stories of crime, murder, betrayal, romance, and the like. But then he just ended up reading from the book. He was just doing a job, like, unfortunately, many teachers do. It was only much later when I grew up that I developed a fascination for history and started reading up on my own. Still so much to read. There is very little that I have covered. And interestingly, I've gotten very interested in the history of mathematics and the history of science. And recently, I bought a book which talks about the history of truth. So that sounds fascinating, isn't it? I will be talking about this sometime later. History of science and mathematics are very, very fascinating areas to explore, and I will again come to this at a later stage. But for today evening, I wanted to regale you briefly, of course, without giving much away, um, from a book which is, in my own words, a delightful romp through history. And this is the way it looks. Have a good look at this. The Courtesan, the Mahatma, and the Italian Brahmin. The title itself makes you want to dive into the pages of the book. Who is this Italian Brahmin? Who is the Courtesan? And what does the Mahatma have to do with all of this? Tales from Indian history. The author is Manu S. Pillai, as the cover says, and Manu S. Pillai is a very young historian. In fact, the Open magazine calls him one of India's finest young historians. So a little more about Manu S. Pillai. I'm sure in this age of the internet you can find out by searching his name. He was chief of staff to the well-known Shashi Tharoor. Shashi Tharoor doesn't need any introductions, and he writes widely in various publications, including the Hindu, Hindustan Time, the Mint, the Lounge, the New Statesman, and so on and so forth. And this book is the third of his books. I located it recently in a store in Bangalore. So, what is this about? It is a delightful romp through history, as I said, and for me, this is one of the best ways of bringing history to the masses. So, what Manu Pillai has done is he has avoided a very academic writing of history, which is the way history sometimes is typically written in academia. Footnotes, research, it has its place, but then if you want to popularize history, if you want to bring it to the lay but intelligent reader, then I think this is the best format. So a few things about this. Each of these articles, there are 60 articles in this book, and each of these are not more than 4 or 5 pages. So you can easily read them. You can read them when you're having your breakfast. You can read them by the bedside. You can carry this book wherever you're going and, quickly munch on some of the chapters. The second part is, of course, the language is kept very simple, so anybody who reads it can understand it easily, and I would highly recommend it as a book that students of history starting from school, the middle and high school in fact, should read this book. Though of course it's not meant for children, but still somebody who is interested in reading and who is not afraid of kind of diving into the written matter would find it very interesting. The third is, of course, the choice of topics, and I want to give you some sense of this is very, very intriguing. It's very interesting. I want to read a little from what the author himself says at the end. So there's this part 1 which talks about stories before the Raj. The part 2 is stories from the Raj, and by the Raj he means, of course, the British Empire, the British Raj. And then part 3, there's a wonderful essay which is titled An Essay for Our Times. And this is, I think, the only piece of writing in this book which is about 14 pages long. The rest of them are 5, 6, at the most 7 pages, sometimes as short as even 3 or 4 pages. So it's all in all a pleasure to read this. What does the content look like? Um, and this is where I would like to give you a sample of the treat that awaits you in this book. And I'm going to take some, quick titles just to illustrate what might lie behind those titles and to get you excited and interested in this. The Italian Brahmin of Madurai. Who is this person? A Muslim deity in a Hindu temple. How the hell did it get there? Right? The world of Shivaji Maharaj. And the world of Shivaji Maharaj that you don't get to see in a typical history textbook. And here is a tantalizing question. What if the Vijayanagar Empire had survived? What if Vijayanagar had survived? Would the course of history of India been different? That's a beautiful question. How can you miss this? The story of the Kama Sutra, page 78, in which he goes to great lengths to explain that Kama Sutra is not a book of sexual acrobatics in the bedroom. It's a lot more than that. And also he shows that the 1600-year-old text has so many women's voices in it. It's so much about living life and morals and relationships and so on than it is about, acrobatics in the bedroom. It's a very nice piece of reading. It's very, very enlightening. Moving on to some samples from the stories from the Raj. The first story, or the first article, 5 pages. What if there was no British Raj? What if the Britishers had not come to India? Would India's destiny have been different? In what ways would this have been different? You see, this is the stuff of history, and this is what a history teacher can actually do. I mean, I can literally feel my hair stand on end when I see these, beautifully written, chapters. A forgotten Indian queen in Paris. Who is this lady? The engineer and his rice bowl, page 204. And you've probably guessed this. You're talking about a person called Sir Arthur Cotton, who is a Britisher, and a very fascinating story about him. Then there is a story about the Phulés and their fight. Jyotiba Phule, Savitribai Phule. Macaulay, of course, who doesn't know about him? Somebody whom we love to hate. When did Savarkar jump the ship? Savarkar? You know Savarkar, right? Veer Savarkar. Why did he jump the ship? There's a chapter on the monk for every Indian. You guessed it right, Swami Vivekananda. And this section again ends with this, like it begins with this question, what if there was no British Raj? It ends with this question, what if the Mahatma had lived? What if Mahatma Gandhi had not been assassinated? What if somebody at that final moment before Nathuram Godse pulled the trigger, yanked out the gun from his hand and saved Gandhi? What would have happened today? And I just want to go to page number 326. It's very difficult to not to be tempted, to read from this particular, chapter, and it's very illustrative to read what Manu Pillai says at the end. If the Mahatma had lived a full life, as he once desired, the obituary on his death would have sadly said, and this is a very telling comment that the author makes, Mr. Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, one-time barrister at law, one-time freedom fighter, and neglected thinker of an orphaned philosophy, passed away yesterday. He was 125 years old and died of a shattered heart in a country he no longer recognized. I think if you read this statement carefully and deeply, what the author is trying to say through this is what we all sometimes feel: is this the India that we really want? Is this the country? Is this the direction in which we want this country to be going? I'm not going to go much further into that discussion because it can take hours and hours to explain what this could mean. So here it is. Pick up this book. Should be available on the web, and nowadays books on the web are available at pretty reasonable rates. And yes, I must tell you one thing: the illustrations are fantastic. I think this is history writing at its best. And here is an author who's got the Sahitya Academy Yuva Puraskar. So he's one of India's youngest and finest historians. He's managed this very difficult task of bringing history into the living rooms and of most houses. Anybody who has this book would savor it, would want to return to it again and again. I just want to end my presentation of this book with a few sentences from the introduction written by MANU PILLAI himself. He says, "We live in times when history is polarizing. It has become to some an instrument of vengeance for grievances imagined or real. Others remind us to draw wisdom from the past, not fury and rage, seeing in its chronicles a mosaic of experience to nourish our minds and recall without veneration the confident glories of our ancestors. Recall, but without necessarily venerating all the time the confident glories of our ancestors. The collection," he says, "is an offering that seeks to reflect the fascinating, layered, splendidly complex universe that is Indian history." Mark these words, because this is the kind of country that we have lived in. Indian history at a time when life itself is projected in tedious shades of black and white. So there is this effort to create one narrative to show that that is India's story. It completely neglects the India which is a palimpsest of emotions, stories, narratives. It's a very, very astonishingly rich world that constitutes India and, in fact, the entire subcontinent. There is much in our past to enrich us, and a great deal that can explain who we are and what choices must be made as we confront grave crossroads in our own times. But in the end, each reader must draw her own conclusions. This book seeks only to light the way and to reiterate the importance of that age-old principle, context. So this is a wonderful book, highly recommended, written in 2019, pretty recent. Go grab your copy and enjoy history, and who knows, you may fall in love with it. Take care.